Be'ez Hashem, I want to talk a little bit, discuss the teachings of a mysterious kind of hidden person. A person that is not really known. A top person that lived in the times, in the 1200s in Spain, so in the times of the Rishonim. Someone that his teachings had a major impact on the teachings of many of the Kabbalah, many of the Kabbalists that lived throughout the ages up until this present time. And although personally he wrote a lot about his personal life as well, he wrote a lot about his autobiography and his inner life and his outer life and where he was and who his students were, who was his teachers. Very little bit of him is known today, and we'll understand soon why. Although his teachings, in an indirect way, had a major impact on the understanding and the relationship to a lot of the ideas that we study even today in Kabbalah, in the Kabbalistic tradition. So who are we talking about? We're talking about Rebbe Avraham Abulafia. Now, Rebbe Avraham Abulafia was a very colorful person in his own personal life. And in Oitzer Eden Hagonos, which is one of the books that he wrote, he authored many, many books. And until very recently, none of the books are really available. Only Chai Elam Haba, one of the books were just available throughout the years. Most of them were just in manuscript. Until very recent, the last 20, 30 years, his books have been published. Many of his books have been published. There are various different types of books. Some are like autobiographical. Some are exactly explaining the teachings that he has. Some are more mystical. Some are what he calls prophetic books. We'll understand a little bit what this is. So there in Aragonos he explains this. It's Aragonos. He lays out a little bit who his life is, but we'll understand a little bit, just a very brief history, just to understand who we're talking about, and then get a little bit deeper into the world and the teachings of Abalafia, which is very much connected to the world of sound. So who are we talking about? Rebbe Avraham Abulafia is born in Spain, in Saragossa, Spain, Catalonia, in 1240. Now 1240 is also the beginning of the 6th millennium. The 40s are always the beginning of the millennium. So it's the beginning of, let's say, the beginning of the 6,000th millennium in Hebrew. So that is already, it's the 5,000th year, like today we're 5,700, etc. So the beginning of that time period, there was the beginning of that time period there was certain heightened awareness that since the Chazal mentioned that in the 7th millennium, the 6th millennia, the 7th millennia is the time of Mashiach, there was a certain messianic fervor in that particular time. Especially he also read this very deeply into the date of his birth in that particular year. Now he writes about himself. Then in his younger years he learned Torah, he learned Gemara, and he learned many things with his father. He writes, Gadalti anar Avra, I was raised next to the river called Avra, and I started reading Chumash, Mikra, Pirish, Dikduk, and grammar with my father, and a little bit Mishnah, and a little bit Talmud, Ksas Talmud, Sharov Lemudei Hoyim, and most of my learning I received from my father. So he studied with his father, and when I was 18 years old, he writes, Vani ben Yudchas Shana, Chai Shana, so 18 years old, my father passed away. And then, my 20th year, Vani ben Yud Shana, Yud is the numeric value of the word 20. When I was 20 years old, I went to go to Eretz Yisrael, to Nar Sambatyan, to cross over Nar Sambatyan. And there I met, on the way, and said I wanted to go through to Eretz Yisrael and pass the river Sambatyan. But there was in the middle of the wars, in the middle of the crusades between the Muslims and the Christians, Yishmael ve'Esav. Ishmael and Esav. And then I went back to Greece, and in the city of Kafu, which is close to Rome, I met an important person, a philosopher and a doctor, and his name was Reb Hillel. So this Reb Hillel, and there I studied philosophy with him. So he studies philosophy. This Reb Hillel seems to be Reb Hillel, the author of Takmuli HaNefesh, which is a sefer that we have, which talks about the afterlife and the soul and the journey of the souls. So is this during this time period that he gets he's trying to travel to Israel, to cross over the Nar Sambatyan, sort of seeking the 10 lost tribes. And because of the Crusades, he returns back into Europe, and he gets married, and he gets involved, and he's studying the Mar Nevuchim, the Guide to the Perplexed. This is where he starts learning in Italy with this philosopher called Reb Hillel. Probably Reb Hillel ben Shmuel, the author of the Takmuli HaNefesh. Then he goes on to say different students that he had, and sometimes he taught the students, and they weren't worthy, and some of them were matzliach a little bit, some of them were successful. And then he's in Barcelona, and he teaches someone called Clonimus, which is an interesting name. That's German. And then finally he has other students, or Moshe, Reb Shem Tov, from the Shem Tov family, a very famous family that lived in Spain. And then he meets someone that he calls Reb Shmuel Hanavi, Shmuel the prophet. And there he receives more traditions. And then the second one of his students is Rabbi Yosef Gikatalia, or Gaktila. And he says that is the student that was Matzliach the most, Matzlach Muflag. This is the student that had tremendous success. Rabbi Moshe Gikatalia. So this student, Rabbi Moshe Gikatalia, would become the very famous author and of the Shari Oira Ginus Egos. Moshe Gikatalia was occupied a lot of the Torah, the teachings of Shari Oira, and Shari Oira, the gates of light, is considered a fundamental text in Kabbalistic tradition. In fact, one of the texts, one of the main svarim that people learn in order to get into the teachings of Kabbalah is the Shari Oira. It's like a fundamental text. So Rabbi Yosef Gikatalia, especially in his other svarim, the Sefer Shari Oira, the book of Shari Oira itself, speaks a lot about the spheres and its relationship to the names of Hashem, etc. The other books deal a lot with oisius, with letters, very much influenced, obviously, as a student, letter combinations and transmutations, all different types of variations of using letters and sounds, and that he received from his teacher, from Abalafia. Rabbi Yosef Gikatalia is a very famous Kabbalist, not only a very famous Mekubal, not only as a Svarim, very niskabel, and part of the Messiah, part of the tradition, but he himself was called a Balanissim, the miracle worker. He was called a Chassid, and he was accepted by everyone. His teacher, on the other hand, we'll see soon, is a little bit more complicated. At the age of 31, Shem Kel, he says, at the age of 31, Bani Bizmana Yossi ben Aleph Lamed Shana, when I was in Barcelona. So there he says, I started learning Sefer Yetzirah with all the commentaries. And I started writing books and of wisdom and books of prophecy. And I had this tremendous amount of spiritual opening and awakening, and tremendous amount of different visions. But I saw things, and they bothered me. They were very problematic. They were overwhelming. And then he says that for 15 years, I had no one. So he said, I see all these false visions, and my mind was greatly confused, and I didn't find a person to show me the right way I should travel. And Satan, Satan, the negative force, was my right side. Satan, and I was very confused, and I felt like I was cursed in these 15 years. Incidentally, in other places he writes that the word Satan is the numeric value of 359, which is also the numeric value of the word Zera Lavan, white seed, which means that he's struggling with these particular eras of Zera Lavatala for these 15 years. And then in the year 46, the Elia, which he says is the numeric value of 46, that's when Hashem desired me and brought me into the holy chamber. Let's go back a little bit. The year when he was 40 years old, so in 1280, this is still in the middle of his years where he's talking about that he was still confused and had no one to talk to. He also traveled to Rome, and he made this very public, that he's going to travel to Rome to meet Nicholas III, who's then the head of the Roman Church, and he's going to speak to him generally about world Jewry, but specifically about trying to persuade him to become closer to Judaism, that their traditions become much closer to Yiddishkeit. And at this point, Nicholas was not in Rome, but he ordered that, and this is Rebbe Avraham writes this on himself, he ordered that Raziel, who's a code name for himself, Raziel is Abalafia's name, the way he refers to himself, because it has the same numeric value as Raziel. Raziel has the same numeric value as Avram, 248. And he says that they should arrest him when he comes into Rome. And they erected, in fact, a stake that they were going to burn him as a heretic, for heresy. And Abalafia writes that even though he knew this was happening, he still traveled there. And he predicted that that Nicholas III will fall, and if he refused to meet him. And then when he passed through the gate, in fact, the news came that he died, that the Pope died, and from epileptic stroke. And the guards saw this as a sign that they should not harm Abalafia. That this was not actually in Rome. This is when he was traveling, so it was in Serena, where he wanted to meet with him, and then they allowed him to return back to Rome. But there he was thrown into prison. Then eventually he was liberated. Again, probably because of some prophetic visions that he had and predictions that came true. And then he went to Sicily. So he's traveling all over. And in Sicily, that's where he started having more students, and he started attracting much more attention. At that point in time in his life, the greatest Gadol Yisrael, the greatest sage, certainly in Sfard, in that area, in Spain, was the Rashba, Shlomo ben Adaris, the great Rashba. The Rashba lived in Barcelona. The Rashba was sort of a student of the Ramban, and when the Ramban left Spain, the Rashba became the Gadol Yisrael. He was a very powerful person, obviously a tremendous Gaon and genius, and he wrote a tremendous amount of Torah. And he wrote on everything. He wrote on halacha and tshuvas and pirushim and agada. And so they asked the Rashba what to do with this person, what to do with Abalafia. Who is this person? What does he represent? Is he okay? And the Rashba wrote back a very sharp letter. And the letter is from the 1290s, and it's a tshuvas Rashba. And the Rashba's tshuva is Siman Tav Kuf Mem Ches. And the Rashba goes into a whole thing about prophecy, whether it's possible, because Avraham Abulafia at this time was calling himself Avraham Haroya, the prophet. And the Rashba goes into a very, very lengthy discussion if prophecy is even possible. Lots of Eretz Yisrael is prophecy possible even today. what's the levels of prophecy, and then he denounces him in very harsh terms. The Rashba denounces him, and because the Rashba denounced him in very harsh terms, he sort of almost disappears, or he stops teaching at least. This is what the Rashba. Later on, some of the other Mekubalim, for example, that was not necessarily from the Mekubalim, but the Chayet, the Chayet, Yehuda Chayet, who wrote a commentary on the Marechas Alakus, which is Tudas Abalafia, associated or contributed to Tudas Abalafia, also a Spanish Mekubal, Kabbalist. So Yehuda Chayet, who was from the Migurusha Svard, who was from the ones that were left Spain in 1492, together with Abarbanel, together with Yitzhak Amor and Ramalshker, many great sages that left Spain at that time from the expulsion of Spain. So he wrote a commentary. The Chayet wrote a commentary to the Merechas Alakus. In the Akdama, he talks about different svarim of Kabbalah, and he says svarim shechiber shmoi Rebbe Avraham, the books that the author Rebbe Avraham wrote, and he called himself, according to his foolishness and his arrogance, he called himself Avraham the prophet. And he shamar in front of al malais dimyonis. He said that he was just he had the myonis shav, and we should stay away from him. And he brings down the Chuvas Rashba. Interesting. In the list of svarim that he brings down, he writes that two things. First of all, he speaks about Abalafia writing a commentary to Sefer Yetzirah using the Mar Nevuchim, which we'll see soon is important. But then he also quotes one of the svarim, the Sefer Zohar Yomish B'Yachad. The Sefer Zohar, which the Zohar was published more recent after, closer to his time, was revealed. Closer to his time, he said, "Lo Yomush v'Gisu B'Yom V'Lav." That's the sefer. That's the book you should really. That's the sefer you should really think about and penetrate and learn. The same thing also the svarim of Rav Yossi Gatalia. Those are also svarim that you should actually spend time with. So he says you should read the svarim of Rav Yossi Gatalia, like the Shayar and the Ginusagas, but not from Abalafia. Anyways, after this tshuva came out, this edict came out about Abalafia from the greatest gadol of that generation, the Rashba, that had a tremendous effect on Abalafia, and then he picked himself up and left Sicily, and he went into exile. Eventually, he settled on a very small island near Malta, off Malta, that's called today Kamina. In 1291, he's he's 51. There he writes his last sefer called Imre Shefer, Words of Beauty. It's sort of like a meditational manual, and he sends it into mainland Europe. And after this year, after 1291, we don't hear from Abalafia any longer. Perhaps he passed away on the island shortly thereafter, or just removed himself further from public view. But either way, we don't hear from him after that time. That's it. And he's probably buried or someone there. It was a deserted island. He lived only alone on this island. There's different traditions about where he's buried exactly on the island, if he had to have his bones in the island, if he's buried in a certain place. But we're not sure. Now, on one hand, this is a very tragic figure, someone that spends a lot of his lifetime in exile, in condemnation. That's the person. On the other hand, history has been very kind to his ideas. Not to the person, but to the ideas that he put forth. We'll understand this. First of all, we'll understand a little bit about what this is, and then we'll understand what his ideas are. In the 16th century, especially, with the Gedolei, that's where, after the expulsion of Spain, some of the great scholars and Mekabalim and halachic writers and poskim and goinim and paitonim, everyone gathered in the small holy city of Tzfas, which is then part of the Ottoman Empire. So they came, once they entered into Turkey, they were able to travel freely and go to Eretz Yisrael, get to Turkey, and go to Tzfas. And that's where there was a gathering of all these great sages. And there we find that Abalafia's Sfarim, the ideas of Abalafia, not the person, they don't even mention him by name, but the ideas of Avraham Abulafia start being revealed. You find this in the Ramak, and you find this in Rebbe Chaim Vital, Shar Kedusha, in Chelik Daled, that they quote him. Now, Shar Kedusha, the fourth part, there's three parts, and it's a gate towards say holiness. The first three parts were always printed, and it's more about the ethics. It talks about Eish Ma'am Rochafer, the four elements, and how it correspond to anger and insatiability and to mindlessness and to depression and to laziness. And it explains how a person has to work on their different middas, different attributes, in order for a person to break through the screen of the world and the screen of consciousness, which puts a limitation of a person experiencing the transcendence and the oneness of Hashem. These are all oilam. These are all the concealments that are screens in the language of the Rambam. So by overcoming these things, by becoming more compassionate and becoming more mindful and becoming less scattered and becoming more joyful, a person is opening themselves up. And then it talks about the different mitzvahs, the mitzvahs, mitzvahs leisase, the positive and negative mitzvahs. This is all like building the person. But the actual part of like more the meditative part, which is Shari Kedusha Chelik Dal, the fourth Chelik, was never printed. And the reason why it was never printed is because the Chidah said not to print it. The Chidah said this is mysterious, and it's only meant to be given over in private, and not something that's given over in public, and it shouldn't be published. So it was never printed. Recently, again, in the last 20, 30 years, someone published it, and it's called Ksavim Chadasha from Chaim Vital, the new writings, or the newfound writings, and there they printed the entire Shari Kedusha, Chelik Dal, the fourth part. And if you look at Shari Kedusha Chelik Dal, you'll see that a large percentage, I don't know, let's say 30% of the teachings that are written there come straight directly, are almost direct quotes from the Sfarim of Abalafia. So they quote him. He's quoted. And he's quoted not only by the Ramak. The Ramak quotes him a few places, but there is, for example, the Ramak in Shar Chaf Aleph, in the Pardes, Shar Protei Hashemus, brings down the whole path of Abalafia, the way he speaks about the different oisias, different letters, and the vowels, and its relationship to this position of the head. He brings down the entire structure of Abalafia. Again, Chaim Vital does this. The Rabbi brings this down. They don't quote him by name, but they quote the ideas. They quote the ideas. So the simple answer for this, why he's quoted by his sefer, or why he's quoted by his ideas and not quoted as the person, the one that Rebbe Avraham Abulafia writes, maybe this is because of derech eretz, a certain deference, a certain reverence to the Gadol Yisrael of that time, which is the Rashba. So since the Rashba wrote very strong things against him, so even though these Mekabalim that lived a few hundred years later adopted a lot of his teachings and incorporated a lot of his teachings, but they're not going to mention by name because of the reverence that they have for the Rashba. Since the Rashba wrote such harsh things about him, so we're not going to quote him by name. But we can also say it's a little bit much deep. It's actually much deeper. On one level, what this means is that the Mekabalim held from his ideas, from his methods of what he taught, but not what he attained in these methods. In other words, Abalafia develops a system, and a system that the Mekabalim believe is a correct system in order to open a person up to see to what? In order to open a person up to open a person up, to have the person become patuach, the person become open to receive some type of higher wisdom or deeper wisdom. But what he wrote, when he was in this transcendent state of the traditions that he received, is lav dafka something that's so interesting to them. In other words, he had a real path how to attain this shefa, but how to receive this influx, this flow. But what he received in this influx was not necessarily emes. In other words, every single experience is both an interaction with something. When a person has a deeper experience with something that is deeper, and we'll explain what that deeper is, there is an interaction between the person's subjective and objective. So there's some type of objective reality, and the subjective is tapping into the subjective. The subjective is tapping into the objective. Now, if a person's subjective is muddied or is unclear, the Chaim Volozhiner writes about his Rabbi, the Gra, in the beginning of Safta Tzniusa, which is one of the deep books of Kabbalah, which the Gra wrote a Pirush. So the Reb Chaim Volozhiner writes that his Rebbe was able to receive really a magid, some type of objective revealing of a higher truth, of a deeper truth. He was on that high level, but he said because he's living in Chutz La'aretz, where the frequency, he's living outside of Eretz Yisrael, outside of the place of redemption, the place of exile. So there's tuma, there's avira, there's a tumas, there's an impurity in the aver, there's like an impurity in the atmosphere, so to speak. Therefore, it's for example, you hook in your channel, your radio frequency to a certain channel, but if there's some particles that's in the air, it'll block the channel from receiving correctly. So you are hooked in to the source, but what's coming through is going to be muddied. That's on an objective level. So there's a muddiness just being there, just being in a certain place. But then also, it's also filtered through your subjective. So according to your subjective, that's what you're going to receive. That's why Abalafia writes many different books that he received while he's in this mystical transmission. And we're not really sure what these svarim are. No one really, these are svarim that are not quoted by Gdolei Yisrael. But they're printed today. You can read them. And to be honest, it's very hard to make out if what he's saying is something that is super profound and therefore beyond comprehension at this point, or is it sort of some type of maybe mystical Gerberish? Maybe it's just like things that are just popping through, but there's actually no cohesiveness, or possibly, they say, don't say lahavdil, but they say that the Moranayim, Chnabala, who is one of the students of the Baal Shem Tov, that the Moranayim, the Sefer Moranayim, which is a very holy Sefer, and a very profound and deep and pristine Sefer, that the Moranayim, when the Chnabler used to say Torah, he said a lot of Torah. Really, the Moranayim is really a large set of Svarim. Let's say 20 Svarim. The Moranayim that we have is a 300-page book. Why? Because the Moranayim said that any Torah that he remembers saying while he said it should not be written down for eternity. Those are the Svarim that you should not print those. The only Torah that you should print is the Torah that came through him, that he doesn't remember saying, because that was when he was a complete, correct funnel to receive that wisdom, that divine wisdom that came through him. When it was Divrei Elokim Chaim, that he was speaking the words of Hashem, he was speaking Divrei Elokim Chaim Dach, he was speaking living words of God, is that those words just were transmitted through him. So he was not, when he was conscious of him saying the Torah, which means that his subjective was still involved in a way that he was conscious that his subjective was involved, that's the Torah that you shouldn't say. That's the Torah that shouldn't be printed, because that's already the I, that's his ego. And he said that's not the real Torah. The real Torah is the one that came through him. But of course it came through him through his own subjective. But his subjective was such a clean vessel that he wasn't even conscious that he was receiving those things, and it was received through him. And you can't compare, it's incomparable, the wisdom the revealing, the teachings, the Torah that comes in the Moranayim, which you can see Yolakus clearly, you can see the divinity, you see the majesty and beauty and holiness in the text, versus some of the Svarim, maybe you have to put on better glasses. The Svarim that you see in Abalafia, the Svarim, let's say Farois, and other books that he writes that are Nevuah. So that could be another possibility. So not only the Eretz for the Rashba, but also because his character was not necessarily such the highest level of character. Maybe, possibly, of course, we don't know, and I'm not going to Chas Shalom say anything that's Hevach, but this is what, according to the Rashba, this is true. So maybe they felt that the technique, the system was correct, but not what he said when he was in touch or aligned in the method that what he was receiving. So therefore, it's not important to the person. This is another level of understanding, and even a deeper level. The entire teachings of Abalafia, which we'll discuss soon, which you didn't yet discuss, Be'ez Hashem, is the idea of deconstructing language. And the point of the deconstruction of language is whether it's deconstruction of language in thought, in words, the way the words are spoken, or it's deconstruction even in the way of people in process of thinking and thought, is the idea is that you stretch language to its ultimate and there into its fullness, let's say, until its limitation, which means you take every possible word and you permeate it in all possible ways. So then you expand the meaning of itself to reach the essence of it, to reach its essence. And then there's an implosion of that idea in itself. And the language itself deconstructs, and then you enter a place that's beyond language, which is the experience itself. To say it a little differently, every single thing in this world has the essential self and the inessential self. Let's say we're talking about a cup, right, or a tree. So there is the essential cupness of cup, that the cup is a cup. And then there's the tzura, the form, let's say it a little differently, there's like the substance, the chomer, that the cup is a cup. And then there's the tzura, the form of the cup. The tzura of the cup is that the cup is round, it's made out of a certain material, it holds a certain amount of ounces, but that's not the cup in itself. When you say what is the cup, and you say a cup is round, okay, a cup also is round. A cup has depth. Okay, a cup also has depth. A cup is made out of, let's say, paper. A cup is also paper. But what is the cup in itself? What is the essence of the cup? What's the cupness of it? There's a story that the Rebbe, the Tzemach Tzedek, once came to the Alter Rebbe. There was one sitting with his grandfather, Alter Rebbe. The Baal Tanya was sitting with his grandfather, the Alter Rebbe. And the Alter Rebbe asked him, Vu is Zayden? Where's your grandfather? So the Tzemach Tzedek, like all little children, when you ask them, where are you? They point. So he pointed to the nose of the Alter Rebbe. And the Alter Rebbe says, that's the nose from the Zayd, this is Zayd Alen. He said, this is the nose of your grandfather, but that's not your grandfather. So he pointed to the eyes. He said, no, this is the eye. He said, that's the eye of the Zayd, it's not the Zayd himself. Then he pointed to his ears, this is the ever from the Zayd, this is the Zayd Alen. So every body part that he pointed to, the Alter Rebbe said that's only the part, that's not the essence. So the Tzemach Tzedek was a smart boy, a little boy. He walked out of his grandfather's room, stayed for a while outside the room. His grandfather continues to learn and got immersed in something else. The Tzemach Tzedek opened the room as a little boy and he screamed, Zayda. And his grandfather turned around and he said, Da Zayda. So that's where my grandfather is, that's the fullness of my grandfather. That's the essence. So when we talk about the essence of something, when we describe things using language is only a descriptive. It's a description of what that thing is. Even when we not only we call things, listen to Lashon Haskami even, Lashas like the Ron writes at the beginning of Durham, it's a consensus that we call this thing a tree, or a table, a table. But even if we say that the word table reflects a certain truth about what the table is, it's only an expression of what the table is. It's only one dimension of the table. But let's say, for example, a very simple way of doing this, which is tziruf, a combination. But this is very simple because there's two letters. Let's say you take the word tzel, and tzel means a shadow. So when I'm talking about a tzel, I'm talking about something that's a shadow of something else. Now, the reverse letters, if the tziruf backwards of tzel, tzadik lamed, which is shadow, the backwards version of that is letz, means a joke or imposter. So if I take the tziruf for both these words, I'll say that what is a shadow? A shadow is a shadow of something else, and it's really a joke because it's just an imitation. It's a clown version of the original thing. So that's the way Abalafia wants to do words. He wants to take every single word that we have. So sometimes it can be names of Hashem, which is for a different direction, a different purpose, a different point in the method. But sometimes there's tziruf, and the way Rebbe Chaim Vital writes this clearly in Shari Kedusha, there could be the tzirufim of just any word. He says choose any word, and then play with the world in all their possible tzirufim, all their possible combinations. What you're doing is you're saying that this thing can be seen from this perspective, it looks this way. From the other perspective, it looks a little bit differently. They're all part of the multiplicity and multidimensionality of what this object is. And by stretching all possible combinations of what this thing is sounded, we go to a place that's beyond that as well. So ultimately, and we'll see how this is practiced, ultimately this is the idea of deconstruction of all thought process and all language. Then the deconstruction of the language allows you to experience a thing that's beyond the language, because the language is just a descriptive, or one form of descriptive definition of what this thing is. So since this is the basis of Rebbe Avraham Abulafia's teachings, perhaps this is some level of poetic justice, that since he deconstructed everything to get to the essence of things, he himself becomes deconstructed, so to speak, and without attribution. So that's he becomes impersonalized. That's part of the way this is unfolding, sort of this way of history, of certainly sacred history. And Messiah's Torah is that he reveals this deconstructionist element, which we'll see Be'ez Hashem in the following shiurim, finds its way very strongly in the teachings of Ramak, but eventually in the teachings of the Baal Shem Tov, which is anticipation of all modern deconstructionists, in my estimation, which is where we're holding today in the world of language in general. So that eventually causes a deconstruction of himself as well. So here's a few of the sources where they quote him, but they quote him without his name. So this is again in the Pardes, in Shar Prati Oisis, in Shar 21, Chaf Aleph, in Rebbe Chaim Vital and Shari Kedusha, which we mentioned is a lot of the things from Abalafia. The Rabbi quotes him in his sefer, in his book Magen David. He quotes Chaim Olam Haba, and he speaks about the 17 letter name of Hashem. And he says Divrei Elokim Chaim, and he says this is Divrei Elokim Chaim. So the Rabbi, who's the Rebbe, again also living the same time period of the Ramak, and a Rebbe, one of the teachers of the Arizal when the Arizal lived in Egypt. So the Rabaz quotes him. Same thing also the Alkabatz, Shlomo Alkabatz, who's a contemporary, also Spanish originally, a contemporary of the Ramak, contemporary race of Cairo, a famous story with Shlomo Alkabatz, the author of L'Chadodi, the famous story with the race of Cairo, and in the beginning of the Dakam Magam Yesharim, and the Shalal Kodesh brings it down, what happened to them in Salonika on Shavuos night. So the Alkabatz also brings down Sefer Chai Olam Haba, and he speaks out the word Moshe, that the hidden letters of the word Moshe, Mem Shin, is Me'ayin, Mem Shin Hey. So then you take out the original letters of Mem Shin Hey, but Mem Mem, Shin Yud Nun, and Hey Aleph is going to be Ma'ayin. This is later also quoted by the Shalach Kaddish, but doesn't quote him by name. The greatest example of this idea of speaking about his farm, but not mentioning his name, not attributing to Rebbe Avraham Abulafia, is in the Shem HaGdolim for the Chidah. The Shem HaGdolim of the Chidah, which is the basic sefer that was written Chaim Yosef David al-Zaloi, one of the great sages, originally from Yerushalayim, and then passed away in Navarna, in Italy, the Rav of Navarna. The Chidah, contemporary of the times of the Baal Shem, the Chidah has a sefer that he is called Merechas, that it's called Shem HaGdolim, the name of the greats, and over there he has two parts. The first one is Merechas Oisius, and the next one's Merechas Svarim. The first one is the different following different names, so he quotes a different tzaddikim, different Gedolei Yisrael by name, and then in Merechas Svarim he quotes the Svarim, their books. So in Merechas of Gedolim in the Oisius in the letters, when it comes to Avram or Aleph Beis, so he says Avraham Abulafia, he says Ayin Chai Elam Haba. He says this, go look at Chai Elam Haba. Just look at the words Chai Elam Haba, which is go to Merechas Svarim, the second part of the book, and you'll see that I speak about Chai Elam Haba. That's one of the books of Abalafia. And in Chai Elam Haba, he writes like this: "We say for Shechibar Avraham Abulafia." That's connected to the name, the 72 letter name of Hashem. And he says V'da. He says I saw the Vrisi al Klaf. I saw this Chai Elam Haba, which means it was in circulation, but as a manuscript. Shai Rashi b'Tshuvoisav, even though the Rashi writes in the Tshuva and the Yashar of Kandi, the Mitzaref l'Chachma, which is another interesting character. Whether he's a Mekubal or not, or a philosopher, it's very hard to know. Even though they make very light of Avraham Abulafia, but I saw that many Gedolei Yisrael, or I saw this Gadol Yisrael, this great, that was Makar that sefer, which means brought that sefer in, and that's the truth. Which means that they quote the sefer, they quote the book, and it's quoted. It's interesting that the Ramak himself also writes, even though he quotes Chai Elam Haba, in that same, in Shar Chafal of Perigimel, Shar Prater Shemes, he talks about one of the things, he says, one of the Mefarshim speak about the name of Hashem as Aleph, Hey, Vav, and Yud, which we'll see later on. Abalafia writes that the letter Aleph is connected to Yud Kei Vav Kei. That's the original name, and it's just hidden in the Eke and hidden in Yud Kei Vav Kei. So he says, Rachman l'Islam Mahaydaita, he says, Chas v'Shalom, to say such a thing. This God forbid to say such a thing, this quote is actually from Abalafia. Okay, so Atkan, this is, up until here, we just know a little bit about his history, his biography, when he lived, and the controversy, and that the fact that he's quoted, and why he's quoted by his books, or why his ideas are quoted. We didn't explain what his ideas are fully. This will take a few shiurim. But he's not quoted by name. It's not mentioned by name. Let's go back to the original point where he speaks about his own self, where he says when he started learning the Moreh Nevuchim, and he writes that he learned it many times, which is the Guide to Perplexed, by the Rambam, by Maimonides, and he wrote a pirush to it. And his pirush that he wrote to it was a commentary based on Sefer Yetzirah, which is a Kabbalistic interpretation of the Moreh Nevuchim. Now, what is the tremendous attraction that Abalafia has towards the Moreh, towards the Guide to Perplexed, the Rambam? So here we'll understand there's a few points that the Rambam makes that are very important to Abalafia. Number one is that according to the Rambam, primarily this is in Chelik Beis, the second part of the Moreh Nevuchim, the Rambam talks about three shittas about how prophecy happens. Either prophecy is something completely that's a gift from above, Ruach Mabarim, has nothing to do with a person's initiative, nothing to do with a person's development, or prophecy is completely dependent on a person's development. You develop a prophetic insight. You develop prophetic possibilities by deepening your thought process, by contemplation and certain type of meditations and certain type of practices that you open yourself up to receive prophecy. The third opinion, which the Rambam says is the correct opinion, is that prophecy is something that is worked on, means you have to develop yourself, which very strongly is supported by Chazal. Chazal basically say that a person has to be in a Shechina Shari, that a person has to be a Usher and a Gadol and a Chacham, and a person that has to be, with joy and not depressed. We find this with in the Nevi'im, that they play music to create a certain joyfulness, and there was a certain developmental level, a mental developmental level, which a person receives and opens himself up to receive prophecy. And then once a person opens himself up to this prophecy, then there's a type of revelation that comes from above. So it's sort of a hybrid, or both, the combination of these both ideas, that it's not completely dependent on man, it's not completely dependent from above, but it's sort of the developmental level of a person developing their capacity to its extreme. Therefore, the Rambam would say that certain great philosophers in history reach Kar L'Nevuah, close to prophecy, which means they didn't receive prophecy itself, it wasn't revealed to them, but they reached the highest capacity of a human capabilities of understanding. And then there's something that comes out, receiving something that's higher. This does two things. First of all, what it does is, and this is a very complicated, controversial issue as well, what is the Rambam writing this? Is the Rambam writing this as a philosophical idea, a construct to understand how prophecy worked in past tense? Or the Rambam, which seems to be suggested by others, and a closer reading of the Rambam, that, especially the way the Rambam completes the Moreh Nevuchim in Perek Gimel Nun Beis, where he completes the whole thing about the whole Moreh Nevuchim of the person experiencing ecstasy and dying from Mrs. Nishikin, which is very mystical writings of the Rambam. It seems that it's possible that the Rambam also is telling a person how they can receive prophecy, or how a person could develop this capacity for prophecy, or at least open themselves up to the ability to receive prophecy. Now, what exactly the Rambam means in terms of prophecy, in terms of what higher level of prophecy, because it's Batla HaNevuah. So, okay, that's already a conversation. What exactly does this mean, Batla HaNevuah? Maybe it means Batla HaNevuah in a way of the prophecies of old, which is prophecy l'doros, and it's for generationals, and it's a prophecy, it's on a cosmic level, but how about inner levels of intuition? The Reb Chaim Vital writes at great length of the different types of Ruach HaKodesh, divine inspiration. It can be a level of Ibur, and it can be a level of impregnation, it can be a level of a dream, it can be a level of intimation, many different levels. We're just using the word prophecy in a very, very broad definition. We're not talking about a person that's prophesizing in the whole world order. Just a deeper awareness of self. The Pinson writes about Chassidus. That's the idea of prophecy, to have a deeper understanding of self. So that's the type of prophecy we're talking about, deep awareness. So it's possible. It's possible. It's possible for everyone that it's available even today on some level. Rebbe Avraham in the Akdama of Shalosh Shus Min HaShamayim has a long arichas, has a long explanation of the different levels of prophecy. And when we see that there were certain people that were called, even in times of Rishonim, that were called Shmuel HaNavi, for example, there were people that were called the Nevi'im. It doesn't mean on a higher level of prophecy, but there was a level of prophecy, which means it was understood that it's possible. Some type of opening was possible. So something we should aspire for, and something that's possible. So this is very exciting for Abalafia. That's number one. It was very exciting for Abalafia because it means that there's some type of technique or some type of possibility that we can develop that will allow a person to have deeper. We'll use prophecy and the way Abalafia actually also uses prophecy, and he calls that Mashiach, and he calls that being anointed, is deep awareness of self, like the highest, deepest awareness of self, of what the person's shayach and neshama is, what your root of the soul is, why am I here, what's my purpose, why I should be doing this. Total clarity. Let's just say that's like the high level of prophecy that we're talking about, or a level of prophecy we're talking about. And the way the Rambam describes this, and this is also something that a lot of the Rishonim speak about. Later, the Rabbi has a long arichas, a long great length in Mechemes Hashem about this. But all the Rishonim really mention this idea, is that there's something that's called Seichel HaPoel, or Seichel Elyon, the higher intelligence, or Seichel HaPoel, which is active intelligence, and then there's something that's called the Seichel HaNikna, the Seichel that's acquired intelligence. In the Seichel HaNikna, Seichel HaNikna is acquired intelligence, means things that we learn and we gain, and we have a deeper wisdom of it. It's acquired. It's the opposite of Hu Amadu Hu Yadei Hu Yadua. It's the opposite of the oneness of wisdom. It's the wisdom that's acquired throughout life. But then there is the active intelligence, the source of intelligence. What's the source of intelligence? To try to make sense out of this. The Seichel HaPoel, the active intelligence, is sort of, this is a mashal of this idea, this is a metaphor of this idea, it's not the unconscious of the world, universal unconscious. It's more like the prototype or the information that gives rise to the manifested reality, which means that everything in this world has its form, has its dimensionality. Everything in this 3-4 dimensional universe has its particular space, its particular time, its particular form, its objective reality, its existence. And everything in this world has sort of, let's just say this on like a scientific level, has like its DNA, its molecules, what it creates it. That's like its information. It's code, let's say differently. So everything has a code. Everything has an informational code, and the informational code is a certain like pattern, and that pattern gives rise to a particular form which shows up as this particular manifestation. There is the active intelligence is kaviyachol, is sort of Hashem has the Creator has a vision. So when Taisa says there's machlokes here, Rabbi Shua, when the world was created, petition Avraham or Nissen Avraham, the world was created, Tisha Nissen, whatever means created, is another conversation. But the idea of creation, is Taisa says, based on a poem of Elazar Kalir, Taisa says Rosh Hashanah that they're actually not a contradiction. But one is with machshava, and one is through thought, and one is through words, which means that before you create, just to use an analogy, to understand this, that through the flesh we understand God, which means through the personal or the microcosmic we understand the macrocosmic. So for us to create something, first we have the idea of the creation, and then we have the creation itself. First is the Torah, the idea of the way that things exist within the Torah, within the world of ideas, and then the way it exists within space, in actual space, physical space. That informational code, that metaboard, that contains all the information of the universe, is not only the universe as it is right now, but it's all the information of the universe, the DNA, the patterns, the information, we'll call it information, from the beginning of time to the end of time. And it's active because it's not just static, that it's stationary, that it just exists, but it's active. It's constantly pushing out new life. Every moment, every millisecond, every nanosecond, every moment that the world is being brought into being, and it's continuous. It's a Savat Yesh Ma'ayin. There's a continuous creation of every single moment from new. That the creation is being manifest every single moment from the unmanifest, and the tree is being a tree, and the tree is not giving flowers, and the flowers are giving fruit, and the flowers are creating, and this fruit, and the fruit is giving birth to new trees. There's a constant movement of creation. Creation is constantly alive. The aliveness of creation is active. It's an active universe. The universe is constantly evolving every single moment. It's moving. There's life. It's teeming with life. That is a manifestation of the unmanifest. That's a manifestation. That's the information revealed in real time. So the active intelligence, the Seichel HaPoel, is the source of all the information of the universe that's in its original source. Kaviyachal in Machshava Kadosh Baruch Hu, that's why it's Olam HaBriya, the world of Bria, or the world of Bina. That the Mekubalim in the Shayar actually brings it down. That the world of Bina, which is Olam HaBriya, the world of creation, is parallel to the Seichel HaPoel with Kabbalah, with the philosophers, the Chacham talk about. Because what we're saying is that in the world of Bina, that's the active intelligence information. When we say that after a person passes on, the individual self, which is really the information of the individual self, the memory of the individual person, becomes part of Olam HaBina. That's what Shire says. It becomes part of Olam HaBina means because it becomes part of that original intelligence, because it's intelligence, it's the information. So the individual memory becomes part of the collective memory, the collective unconscious. But it's not an unconscious that's created through conscious selves that creates this collective unconscious. It's a very Jungian idea, but it's not that that's the way it's created. On the contrary, it's continuously being created from that as well. But the origin of that idea is actually from the Seichel HaPoel. The Seichel HaPoel is what gives the active intelligence, what gives the Seichel HaNikna its ability. And this is what the Rambam writes. I hope this is coming out clear. This is what the Rambam writes is Nevuah. Nevuah prophecy is when the individual self, the individual seichel, the individual intelligence of the person becomes hooked in, sort of like you plug in to the seichel HaPoel, to the active intelligence, and therefore all the intelligence becomes revealed. Certainly all the intelligence of who I am and what my life has to be, and all the intelligence that's created to my life, the people in my life, the jobs that I have, the place that I live, all becomes clear because the active intelligence in the information place is being revealed to me now. And maybe in the highest level of prophecy, all the information, all the universe from the past and the future becomes revealed, or people, and can see a person's shayash and neshama, can see where people come from and what their purpose is, and can see how time is unfolding and the progression of time. That's all part of the higher levels of prophecy. The more connected, the more transparent that the individual self becomes to the openness of the seichel active intelligence that's becoming revealed through them. So Abalafia is very interested in this, and he learns the teachings of Kabbalah, not for the purpose of understanding and philosophizing about the structure of the universe. But for him, it's about the experiential idea that the Mekubal, the student of that's studying this, becomes unified with the active intelligence. And the path through which he develops and the method through which he creates is that through the world of tziruf, through connecting through the different sounds, through connecting through the different aspects of the sounds and the dimensions of the multidimensionality of everything, and then the explosion or the implosion of the thing in itself, of language in itself, that opens ourselves up to the experience itself of the experience of the thing itself without the language that's the construct, that's the limitation of the construct. Or we'll see soon through chanting of the names of Hashem, using all the various possible combinations through which those sounds, which means essentially connecting to all the sounds of the universe. Through that, a person receives and enters into a place that's connected to the moichin, an active intelligence, which perhaps is also another way that the Arizal calls moichin. Shachas ha-moichin is the main teaching in the Torah Sari, is to draw down moichin. So in the Arizal, you're drawing it down into your life. In Abalafia system, you're entering yourself into that state. So in the Torah Sari, you're understanding the divine and making sense out of it, and you're understanding the structures of the universe. But here it's a different direction. You're moving. The movement is from top down, and therefore it's the experience of that. And that is what he receives from the Rambam. He receives this, but he develops through tzirufim, which is going to be a different direction. The Rambam does not talk about this at all. Through the tzirufim, he develops a system of how a person can enter into the active place of intelligence. Now, the Chachmas HaTziruf itself, which we'll understand soon, what exactly is the Chachmas HaTziruf, what is the wisdom of Tziruf, is already mentioned in the Gemara. The Gemara already mentions the idea of Chachmas HaTziruf. The Gemara Brachas, when it speaks about Tzalkel, that Betzalel, the architect of the Mishkan, who was a 13-year-old boy, that Betzalel was already a person that understood the wisdom of the tzir of Shemayim v'aretz, the combinations that created the universe. Okay, so that's Atkan. Now we're going to go a little bit deeper to understand a little bit more the context of Abalafia. And to that, we have to understand a little bit what happened with the Rambam. So the Rambam is, of course, the Rambam, Moshe ben Maimon, one of the greatest of all time. The Moshe Lakam Kamoshe. So the Rambam, born in Spain, in Andalus, and then he passes away in 1204. He passes away in Egypt. The Amaleks came and attacked, the Berbers came and attacked Andalus. And that was the end of Yiddishkeit there. And then everything moved more north to Catalonia. That's what the Rajban, the Ramban, that's the second period of the Gedolei Yisrael that lived in Spain. First one was at the south of Spain, where the Rif, originally from North Africa, and then the Rimigosh, and then the father of the Rambam, who was a student of the Rimigosh. This is on Al-Sana, the famous yeshiva. And the Yehuda Levi and Even Ezer, they were all part of that Chabor. That was the Andalusian Rishonim. Chavis Alavavas, Chayim Pekuda, a little earlier at that time period, a little earlier, the 1000s. So the Rambam is writing his Sfarim, the Yad HaChazaka. So he writes the Pirush HaMishnayos when he was very young. He writes it in Judaic Arabic. Then he writes it in Latin. He regrets it. He should have wrote it in Lashon Kodesh originally. But then he starts writing the Yad HaChazaka. The Yad HaChazaka, these 14 books. When the Rambam starts writing the Yad HaChazaka, which is the major book of the Rambam on Halacha, the people that receive it with the most enthusiasm is the Chacham Provence, is the Jews and the scholars that live in Provence. Provence is sort of northern Spain, and the Chacham Provence became very attached to the teachings of the Rambam, and they're reading the Rambam, and they're becoming big students of the Rambam. The Rambam actually, Chacham L'Nil, and the Rambam has letters to them, and then they receive Sefer Amada. So in the beginning there was a controversy with the Svarim of the Rambam, because the Rambam didn't quote sources. The Rambam just wrote it straight up without sources. And also the Rambam writes that, different than the Rif, which is the original commentator on the halachic decider Paisek on the Gemara, is that the Rif basically condensed the Gemara, and he only did it to the Gemaras that were relevant today. The Nidron Kacha, for example, that things that are not relevant today, there's no base on English, so the Rif didn't write. He only wrote on the Gemaras, mostly Choshen Mishpat issues that were very much relevant, and also Archaim, what we call Archaim issues, which is a construct that happened later by the Torah. But that idea with day-to-day life issues and issues that are relevant to the monetary issues. And that's the way it was. That, and if a person wanted to know halacha, wanted to know law, they had to look into the Rif. Certainly, if you're in Spain, that's the way you paskin according to the Rif. There were even yeshivas that only learned the Rif; they didn't learn a Gemara, and that's the way it was done. And the Rif was the Rosh. That was the beginning of the writing halacha clearly. So after the Goinim, first the people used to write the Goinim used to write the Shuvas, but then the Torah moved from Baghdad. Surah Pibelissa were then in Baghdad. They weren't Surah Pibelissa; these are the two schools of Rav and Shmuel. But eventually, they were time later Goinim. They were moved to Baghdad, and then after the 1000s. The Torah moved to more into Spain, and then eventually, and at the same time, Rabbi Hananel, which is in Tunis, and the Torah moved into Spain. The Rambam, the tremendous chiddush of the Rambam is that the Rambam writes on Kol HaTorah Kula, on the entire Torah, all laws. The Rambam also is very clear. This is the psak. This is the way you have to do things. And the Rambam doesn't quote source. So that itself was a little bit of controversy. And famously, the Ravid. who is the Rav of Paskirs, which was a small little town in Provence, writes a very strong critique on the Rambam called Agaz HaRambam, Agaz HaRavid on the Rambam, which is printed with the Rambam himself. But of course, that's, the 10% that he argues, but 90% he agrees with the Rambam, which means that the Rambam, everyone agreed that the Rambam is one of the great Gedolei Yisrael and was accepted. Then then they received the Sefer Hamada. And afterwards they received the Moreh Nevuchim, the Gaita Perplex. And this created a tremendous divide between the Chacham of Provence. And Be'ez Hashem will continue and discuss this, and again a little further into Abalafia. But for now, Ad Kan. All right.